So we've been studying the Amidah, or the Tefillah, or the Shmona Esrei, depending on how we want to refer to it. We've seen it referred to in all three ways. And we're going to look in detail now at the first bracha of the Amidah, of the standing prayer. We call it Avot, which for now let's translate. Well, on this chart, we can translate it as ancestors. Although maybe for the beginning of our learning today, let's actually translate it a little more literally as fathers or patriarchs. And in our Siddurim, if you've got Siddur Sim Shalom for weekdays, you can find it on page 36A. Will be the traditional form. And in the Siddur Sim Shalom for Shabbat, it's going to be on page 115A. Okay, and this is the language of the prayer. We looked at this a little bit last week, but let's just for reminder's sake, let's read it again. I'll just read it in English. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, and God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, God the great, the mighty, and the awesome, God most high, who bestows good kindnesses, and is master of all, and remembers the kindnesses of the ancestors, and brings a redeemer to the children of their children for the sake of his name in love. King who helps and saves and shields, blessed are you, Adonai, shield of Abraham. That is the opening blessing of every Amidah. And we talked last week about what the major themes are. So let's go on. Let's see if we can identify where this prayer might come from, or at least I should say where the rabbis say that it comes from. And as one might guess, they are not in total agreement with one another. And I'll make myself a little smaller if I can. There we go. Okay, so this is a passage from the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Brachot, and we begin. Itmar, it is said, who stated, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina Amar. So we have Rabbi Yossi saying in the name of Rabbi Chanina, Tefillot Avot Tiknun. So the Tefillot, the prayers, we'll just translate it somewhat generically that way. Avot Tiknun. The Avot, say, established them or decreed them. Right? So the Avot, the patriarchs, so we're talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we've got Rabbi Chanina teaching that the Tefillot originated all the way back in Genesis from the patriarchs. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Amar Tefillot Keneged Tamidim Tiknum. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said that the Tefillot were decreed or were established, instituted, based upon the Tamidin. So the Tamidin are the daily offerings. So the Korban Tamid, the regular sacrifice, this is the offering that was every single day of the year in the temple, was offered by the priests on behalf of the Jewish people. And so Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is suggesting, not suggesting, but saying that the Tefillot were maybe...
Somebody needs to mute themselves.
Okay, try that. That the Tefillot were modeled after the daily offerings. I'm getting a little bit of feedback here.
I think it's coming from Joan.
Okay, if it comes back, I'll experiment around. Okay, so we've got two different versions. We've got a disagreement among the rabbis about what the origin of the tefillah is, and they probably are talking about the Amidah when they talk about that. So which is it? Is it was it created by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or is this something that is somehow corresponding to daily offerings in the temple. And we already saw some, in earlier weeks, a suggestion that elements of the prayers were in fact modeled after things that took place during Second Temple times. Although in this case, we're talking about specific time-bound sacrifices being the models for what eventually became to be known as the prayers. And this is significant because it would radically change the timing of when the Amidah first came into existence. I guess one question to consider is, are these rabbis disagreeing with each other? Right?
Were there 3 Tamid offerings?
Are they really trying to say 2 different things? All right, so we begin. Tanya Kavate Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. So Tanya is a word that the Talmud used to introduce a Braita. So a really old teaching dating to the time of the Mishnah, sometime in the 2nd century, preserved in the Babylonian Talmud. So what the Gemara is saying is that we've got this Braita, this teaching, that supports what Rabbi Yossi brought in the name of Rabbi Chanina. So Vitanya Kavate Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. And there's also a Braita, the 2nd century teaching, that supports what Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is suggesting, right? So these 2 rabbis, their statements seem to be reflecting 2 different teachings from the 2nd century. So now, as we might expect, we're going to now see each of those two teachings. So here's the first one. Tanya Kavate the Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. We're going to look at the first one, which is by Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. Avraham tikain tfilat shacharit. So we have Abraham. He established tfilat shacharit, the Amidah of the morning. All right. How do we know? Shene'emar vayashkem Avraham baboker el makom asher amad sham. So, and this is the Torah portion that we read just a few days ago. We have Abraham rose early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And so this is Genesis chapter 19, verse 27. Abraham gets, right? And then it goes on, Ve'ein Amidah ela tefillah. And the word Amidah, which means to stand, I'll translate it literally. The Amidah does not mean anything except for tefillah, right? In other words, when the Torah says that Abraham stood before the Lord, that act of standing should be understood to mean that he was standing in prayer, right? And the prayer being the Amidah, what we know as the Amidah. So how do we know this? How do we know that the word Amidah is hinting at prayer? Shene'emar vaya'amod Pinchas vayifalel. All right, so now we have a citation from Psalms 106. And what does it say? Pinchas stood up and prayed, and the plague ended. So if you maybe remember the story where this is at Baal Peor, and the Midianite or Moabite women get sent in to seduce the Israelite men, and it leads to a big disaster, and God gets angry and sends a plague, and Pinchas comes in with a spear and stabs 2 of the chief perpetrators of this idolatry, and that brings the plague to an end. And what is the language that's used in the psalm that is thinking back to this event? Vaya'amod Pinchas vayifalel. Pinchas stood up, vayipalel, and he prayed. Right? So we have in Psalms a connection between standing and praying, and therefore, when we hear about Abraham standing, we can understood him to be praying as well. Right? This is standard rabbinic analogy. This is very good rabbinic logic. So this is a good proof text. Mm-hmm. All right. Next, Yitzchak tikain tfilat mincha. All right. So Isaac, he established the tefillah of mincha, the afternoon prayer.
But for Abraham doing things in the morning, it says that he rose early in the morning, but then he had prayed the previous evening.
That's where
It said he had stood the previous evening where he argued with God before Sodom was destroyed.
Yeah, so this is right after he has just argued with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, and then he gets up early in the morning to go and see what the fate of the cities is. Yeah, so you're reading too much by the pshat, I think.
Couldn't he done both?
At night? Well, no, because we can't have Abraham establishing the evening prayer. We got to save that for Jacob. Yeah. So what do we have in this verse? We have the word boker, morning, and we have the word amad, standing. And never mind the fact that the standing in reference refers to the standing that he did the day before. That's not important. Important is the
associated with standing and prayer is only through Psalms. It's close enough for rabbinic logic.
Close enough, right? All right, so Isaac, how do we know? Shemar vayitze Yitzchak lasuach basareh lifnot arev. So Isaac, so this will be in this coming week's Torah portion. Isaac went out lasuach, to converse in the field toward evening, right? Evening's coming close. We're not yet at evening. It's kind of late in the afternoon, and he's doing this thing called lasuach. And then the Braita continues, Ein sicha ela tefillah. So the word sicha, this conversing, means tefillah. That means prayer. How do we know? And this is a very similar move as we just saw. Shenamar tefillah la'ani chi ya'atov lifnei Adonai yishpoch sicho. So again, we're going to quote Psalm 102, a prayer of the afflicted when he is faint and pours out his complaint, his sicho, before the Lord, right? So now we have this word siach again, and here it's clearly a person is turning to God in prayer, and therefore if we have the word siach appearing in Psalms, and we see it also in Genesis, we can understand siach to be the same thing, and therefore Isaac is davening mincha. And now the third one, Yaakov tikein tfilat arvit. So Jacob, he established the evening prayer. Shneamar vayivga b'makom vayalen sham. So Jacob, vayivga, he encountered the place and he slept there, for the sun had set, right? And so this is Genesis chapter 28. This is before Jacob has his vision of the ladder with angels going up and down and God standing next to it, and God promises, or God blesses Jacob and says that God will protect Jacob as he's about to leave the promised land, fleeing from Esau, his brother. And then Jacob wakes up and he says, the Lord is in this place and I hadn't known it. And then he makes a vow saying, if God is with me and protects me and gives me food and shelter, and allows me to return safely, then God will be my God, and I vow to give a tithe, a tenth of all that I own, to the Lord. So we've got the word vayifga, to encounter, to come upon a place, being seen as prayer, and so now we need to prove it. Ein pegia ela tefillah. So this pegia, this encountering, has to mean prayer. Shne'emar, now we're going to quote Jeremiah, ve'ata al titpalel ba'ad ha'am hazeh, ve'al tisav adam rina u'tfilah ve'al tifgabi. This is kind of the opposite, but and you do not pray on behalf of this nation, and do not raise on their behalf song and prayer, and do not tifga, do not encounter me, for I do not hear you.
Rabbi, you need to lift the text so we can see it.
You can't see the text?
A little bit, just a little.
Yeah, just a
If you
little.
move your mouse cursor from the bottom of the screen, the zoom bar might
There you
about
go. That's good.
Is that better? Okay.
I was able to see it before you did that.
You were. Okay. How about now? Is that good?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So we've got Jeremiah being told not to pray on behalf of the people because God wants to shmeiss them. But the important thing is we have the word titpalel, to pray, tisav adam, to raise up your voice for them, and tifga, to tifga before me, to encounter before me. But so it's the same verb that we saw with Jacob, and here in Jeremiah, it's pretty clear that it's some sort of prayer, and therefore we can say that when Jacob is tifga, is vayifga, that what the Torah is saying is that he's actually praying. So Jacob, therefore, is the founder of the evening Amidah. So that's this Breita. And so if we look back, when Rabbi Yossi, in the name of Rabbi Chanina, said that the patriarchs established the tefillot, the three Amidot of the day, this Breita is what he's talking about.
Mhm.
All right, so that's a created text. Now, what problems might we have with this argument?
I don't know.
I don't understand the question. Which argument?
What's the problem with this suggestion that the Amidah was established, or the three Amidot, daily Amidot, were established by the patriarchs?
I think it's does not explain Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, because he said that it's against the korbanot.
Right. Well, so that we've got a contradiction there. But even more, like, how come we never hear about anybody ever davening?
Right. It's very
Amidah.
interpretive, and there's nothing in the Peshat to say that
Yeah.
the patriarchs prayed. They either build pillars, or they make sacrifices, or they're talking to God and God talks back.
Right.
And I don't know about you, but I don't hear God talking back when I pray Amidah.
Right. So yeah. So it's just we kind of
it's
have this big
outside.
black hole of prayer from the time of Abraham up to the time of the rabbis when they're fixing the form of the tefillah. Maybe they mean tefillah in a broader sense, that we've got the idea of praying in the morning, praying in the afternoon, praying in the evening as being something that we're pointing back to the ancestors doing. But the idea that there's some sort of obligation to pray at fixed times of the day on a daily basis, we don't see much evidence of that.
But there was, Rabbi. We have to say the Shema when you get up and when you go to sleep.
Who says that?
Well, I
Well,
just said it, but I guess you didn't say that. Don't you have to say the Shema when you rise and when you lie
Yeah,
down?
but who says we have to say that?
Well, I mean, I heard it, but I feel, I mean, my question is, that's not really my question, but we are obligated, and one of the results of us being obligated to say all these things is we keep it. This is from times when there was no book.
Right.
written
So
down.
the answer is that the rabbis instituted that obligation. Right. And we saw this when we were studying the Shema earlier. We saw that the rabbis in the Mishnah identify the obligation to say the Shema twice each day when we lie
That
down
way
and
it'll never be lost.
yeah. I mean, but I think we can point to the rabbis as providing this framework for prayer, but we don't see biblical figures offering regular prayer. What we see in talking about the temple offerings, we see regular sacrifice being done on a daily basis at particular times in a ritualized manner. But every example of prayer that we have in the Torah seems to be much more extemporaneous.
But this is the rabbi's way of, as you usually use the term, creatively tying what they're working on back to Torah.
Exactly.
Right.
We see this kind of thing all the time, right?
The theme that you keep repeating, that in order to innovate, you have to make it look older.
Exactly. So I might describe this really, it's a drash, as being homiletical in nature or theological in nature. Right? It's telling a story that's trying to root our daily prayer in something that the founders of our religion did. So let's look at the next proof for Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. So it begins, V'tanya kavate Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. So here's the second Breita. Mipnei ma amru tfilat hashachar ad chatzot, sherei tamid shel shachar karev v'holech ad chatzot. So here we have a much more technical type of Braita. So he says, why did they say that Tfilat HaShachar, the morning prayer, the morning Amidah, must be recited up until Chatzot? Chatzot means noon, right? And not 12 o'clock, but noon as in the midpoint of the daylight hours. Why? Sherei Tamid Shel Shachar Karevo Lechad Chatzot. Because the Tamid of the morning, so the Tamid is the daily offering. The daily offering every day had to be made up until noon, right? So you had a time frame during which the priests needed to make that offering, and the deadline was by noon. And then Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad arba sha'ot, sharei tamid shoshacha karev holech ad arba sha'ot. Rabbi Yehuda, he disagrees. He says we have until the 4th hour of the day to say the Amidah, because he held that the priests had until the 4th hour of the day to offer the daily morning offering. Okay, so what have we just done? He's talking about really the halacha around the timing of the morning sacrifice, and he's saying, look, we saw this back actually in the Talmud itself, in the Mishnah itself, where we're explicitly tying the timing of saying the Amidah to the timing of making the sacrificial offerings. So it's pretty clear that there is a direct connection between the Amidah and the sacrifices.
Well, and it's interesting because the rabbis are also, I forgot what the term is. It's almost like egalitarian, but it's not referring to male, female. They're taking a practice that was the priest's obligation, and now it's every man's obligation through prayer.
Yeah.
In the absence of sacrifice.
Yes, they're expropriating it from the priests, which is pretty audacious.
What's the term that means taking something that was for the elite and making it for the masses?
You can say that they're democratizing it, or making it egalitarian, maybe.
Yeah.
Egalitarian isn't just male female.
Right. Yeah, they took something that applied to an elite class and they said this is something that applies to everyone. And we'll keep going. And you can probably anticipate what's coming next. Umipnei ma amru tfilat mincha ad ha'erev shere tamid shel ben arbaim karev holech ad ha'erev. Right. So how do we know that the afternoon prayer needs to be said up until the evening? Because the tamid, the daily offering of between the erevs, between the evenings, you have up until evening in order to offer, right? So there's a daily mincha offering, and you've got until evening in order to offer it, and that's the justification we give for the timing of the mincha amidah. And then, just as he did before, Rabbi Yehuda has a different ruling. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad plaga mincha sharei tamid shel ben arbaim karev holech ad plaga mincha. So Rabbi Yehuda says, no, we have until this time period called plag hamincha, because the daily afternoon offering could be off. Its final deadline was plag hamincha, the midpoint of the afternoon. The midpoint of the afternoon, I think, is actually 3/4 of the way through the afternoon. So if you imagine, we've got a total of 12 daylight hours. So they identified as, I think, the 10.5 hour of the day as being the deadline. All right, and now finally, how do we know that Tfilat HaErev, the evening prayer, has no fixed time? In other words, you have throughout the evening, throughout nighttime, you can recite the evening Amidah. So right before dawn, you can say it. Sheharei evarim ufdarim shelo nitaklu miba'erev krevim v'olchim kol halayla. Because all of the limbs and the fats that were not consumed, right away, they would kept on being burned and offered throughout the nighttime, all the way until morning. And in fact, this discussion about the timing of the evening. Actually, for the timing of the evening Shema is the very first discussion in the Talmud, right? They talk about until what time does one have to recite the evening Shema, and they talk about the different watches of the nighttime in the temple and the sacrifices and it. So I would suggest that this type of answer is a historical answer, right? Earlier we saw a more homiletical, a more theological answer. It ties into the legend and the mythology of Judaism, and this is much more practical. It's about, without a temple, we need something to take the place of all of these daily sacrifices, and so prayer is going to take that place. And so we're going to use some of the rules for the sacrifices to establish the parameters of our daily prayer.
Rabbi?
Yes.
This also ties in, though, to the idea that you can't read Torah without understanding the oral Torah that goes with it. And so that's how this, because this is considered part of the oral law, these discussions. And therefore, this also ties it to, like, we were supposed to read the written Torah with this in mind, that the rabbis read it, that the rabbis had their prayer morning, evening, and noon. I mean, morning, afternoon, and evening.
Right. So, but we see two different versions of the timing of prayer. Right. And both of these teachings, they talk about takana, right? A takana is a decree. We are establishing something to be a requirement that God didn't establish this as a requirement. People established this as a requirement. That's what a takana is. And so they both, at the very beginning, they both used that same word to talk about the establishment of daily prayer at specific times of the day. And we have two different verses. So on the face of it, they're disagreeing with each other. And so it raises a question: Is daily prayer, is it biblically required? Is it required by the Torah or not? Right?
If Torah has to be understood with the oral Torah, then that answers the question easier.
Well, what would Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi say?
I don't know. I wish we could ask him.
Yeah, it would be nice, right?
We can ask them.
But it almost doesn't matter because prayer, regular prayer, is a core part of Jewish life, and the framework that the rabbis created, whatever their inspiration might have been, is something that we still follow today. Essentially the same. I mean, there's variations in terms of the exact words, and we've added a lot to it, but we follow the exact same structure that the rabbis established right after the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay, now we're going to shift gears a touch and talk about Ben Sirach. Anybody heard of Ben Sirach? The wisdom of Ben Sirach. So this is part of the Apocrypha. So this is included in, I guess, the Catholic Bible. In, I forget what language, maybe in Greek or something like that. And it wasn't passed down in Hebrew. This is also referred to as Ecclesiasticus. All right, that's I guess a Greek word. Solomon Schechter had a theory that the wisdom of Ben Sirach was in fact written originally in Hebrew, that it was a Jewish text going back to the Second Temple times. There's evidence of that because Ben Sirach is quoted by the Talmud on occasion. So it seems to be the case that the rabbis were familiar with at least some of what appears in the wisdom of Ben Sirach. So Solomon Schechter, he had his theory that there was a Hebrew original. And so the story is that when the two kind of amateur biblical scholars went to Egypt and they bought these manuscripts and brought it back and showed it to Solomon Schechter, he looked at it and he recognized it for exactly what it was, which was the Hebrew original of Ecclesiasticus or Ben Sirach, and then he wrote he transcribed it, and that's what led him to go down to Egypt and to start collecting as much of the Cairo Geniza as he possibly could. So okay, so now in addition to that, portions of Ben Sirach have also been found among the Qumran caves, so the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's portions of Ben Sirach. So and that's significant because now we're talking about, scrolls that go back to the 1st or 2nd century BCE that were being used by, whatever Jewish groups were there in Qumran, and this seemed to have been a sacred text to them. So Ben Sirach has 51 chapters. This is chapter 51, obviously. And when it gets to verse 12, well, let's just say verse 13 appears in 13 to 20 or 21 or whatever, appears in the Qumran scrolls. Verse 12 does not. It appears in Hebrew and was discovered in the Geniza. And interestingly, it does not appear in the Apocrypha version of it, right? So it's not passed down in the Greek. So we've got a Hebrew version of it, but not the Greek version of it. And it is modeled after Psalms. It's in fact, the portion of it that comes right after this is included in a scroll that's called the Psalms scroll from Cave 11 or something. And so in it follows, and we'll see in a moment that this sounds pretty similar to one of the Psalms. But so here is I'm pretty sure this is the passage that Salman Schechter had. And so let's see what it says. Let's just look at the third line down. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov, ki le'olam chasto, hodu le'el atishbachot, ki le'olam chasto. And then it continues following that format. This is modeled after Psalm 136, right? And we pray Psalm 136 as part of the Psuke de Zimra on Shabbat and on festivals. So there's some overlap, but mostly we have different terms. So let's think about this as a prayer, a hymn of some sort from the 1st or 2nd century before the Common Era. And it uses a lot of language that might sound familiar to us. So I'll point out a couple. Hodu le'el hatishbachot, right? To the God of praises. Does that sound like anything? All right. So Yishtabach Shimcha La'ad Malkeinu at the very beginning of Shachari uses the same language, right? Tishbachot, El Melech Gadol Batishbachot. And this is just El Hatishbachot. Next, Hodu L'Shomer Yisrael, the guardian of Israel. We haven't gotten to that yet, but that's a prayer that we're going to find later on. Hodu L'Yotzer HaKol. That sound familiar?
Yotzer HaMeorot.
A little bit before that. This is the first bracha of Shachari. Yotzer or vorei choshech, oseh shalom uvorei hakol. Right? So kind of misciting Isaiah, but here we have Yotzer Hakol, the former of everything, the one who founds everything, the one who creates everything. Next, Hodu LeGoel Yisrael, Redeemer of Israel. Well, we just saw that before the Amidah, Gaal Yisrael. Next, Hodu LeMekabetz Nidchei Yisrael. We haven't gotten to that yet. That's going to be in the Amidah. Hodu LeVoneh Iro Umikdasho. Praises the one who builds his city and its mikdash, its sanctuary. Hodu LeMatzmiach Karen Levet David, who causes a horn to sprout from the house of Jesse. Right? That's going to be, that language we'll see in the Amidah as well. This one's interesting. Hodu levocher bivnei tzadok lechohen. Blessed, praise is the one who chooses among the children of tzadok as kohen, as priests. Who are the children of Tzadok? the Sadducees.
Mm.
Okay. Now, interesting. The Sadducees were kind of competitors to the Pharisees, who were the predecessors of the rabbis. The Sadducees were the ones who tended to be in power in the temple. That's where the high priests came from. The rabbis, despite all of their halachic interpretations of of what the rules were for the temple, weren't actually in charge. It was the Sadducees who were in charge, the Bnei Tzadok. So here we have the author of this hymn praising God for choosing the Sadducees as the priests. All right, now here's the next one. Hodu lemagena Avraham ki leolam chasto. Give praise to the Magena Avraham, the shield of Abraham, or the one who shields Abraham. Hodu litzur Yitzchak. Give praise to the rock of Isaac. Hodu le'abir Yaakov. Give praise to the mighty one of Jacob. Okay. The next, Bocher Tzion, the one who chooses Zion. Lemelech Malchim. Give praise to the King of Kings of Kings. That sound familiar? Melech Malchei Melachim.
HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Right, that's from Aleinu. Right, so this expression, the King of the Kings of Kings. And then, all right, so that's the end of the Hodus. All right, so anyway, so this is really interesting because we've got this text that predates the rabbis by a couple hundred years, that includes a lot of language that the rabbis incorporate into the fixed prayers that they've given us, which would suggest that this language is in the air, right? This, people are already praying, and they're kind of some standard types of prayers and standard language of prayer that's used. And so the rabbis aren't necessarily making something, completely up, right? They're taking traditions that already exist, and now they're kind of framing them in a way that will be meaningful to them.
Rabbi?
And as far as the Avot, the first prayer of the Amidah, the reason I brought this here is because it uses this term Magen Avraham, the shield of Abraham, which that's the Chatima, that's the closing blessing of Avot. Baruch Atah Hashem Magen Avraham, the shield of Abraham.
Rabbi?
Yes.
When Orthodoxy says that they only want people to study from within the framework, the accepted framework, when they find old things like this, is this from within or without?
That is an excellent question.
Jewish for sure.
That is an excellent question. So what is Ben Sira is this really weird in between, because it wasn't preserved in Hebrew. And it was part of it was in Greek, and it was in the, part of the Catholic Bible. So that would kind of puts it as a kind of an off limits text. But the rabbis of the Talmud quote it. So they had it. And then when it shows up in the Geniza in Cairo, that would suggest that there are other Jews that have it also in the early Middle Ages. So what its role? I mean, Ben Sirach is very interesting to scholars of the Bible, and certainly there's plenty of Orthodox scholars in academia who would be very interested in Ben Sirach. You might not see this being studied in yeshivas. Probably not. You probably would not. It is available on Sefaria. If you're interested in exploring more of Ben Sirach.
So
Okay.
I'm curious about the Geniza.
Yeah.
They had Genizas way back when.
So yeah, so a Geniza, just a quick review. Geniza means hidden away.
Yeah.
And so the idea of a Geniza is that any text that has holy language on it can't be thrown away, right? It needs to be buried,
Right. Yeah.
right? And so what happens is that you can't, people don't have access to an open grave whenever they want. So they collect it. Right, and people tend to collect them in synagogues and things like that. Right, this happens today. People will bring old Siddurim or Hebrew books to the shul because they know these are Sifrei Kodesh, these are holy books, and we can't just recycle them or whatever. Right. So at the shul, we hang on to these things, and then every couple of years, I'll make arrangements to bring it to a cemetery so that they're kind of dealt with properly. And so in Cairo, at the synagogue in Cairo, there was this geniza that had been collecting materials for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they never set out to bury it. So it was like it's in this closet in the top of the synagogue. And so people kind of knew about it, but nobody had really started, some of the antiquities sellers in Egypt knew that they could make some money by pulling these things out and selling it to tourists. So that's what these women who were Christians, that's what they bought when they were down in Cairo, and they brought it up to Cambridge to Salman Schechter, who was the preeminent scholar of Judaism of the day, and so he saw it and he recognized it for what it was. Right, and then ever since, people have been deciphering the texts from the Cairo Geniza, and they're not even close to being done with it. And they found Maimonides' signature in stuff in his own handwriting in the Cairo Geniza. Well, there's a lot of junk there also, right? So they found ketubot, wedding documents, which is really interesting when we see what in the real world what people were actually putting into their ketubot.
So, Rabbi, is this when you were saying that this was quoted in the Talmud, you're not referring to this particular passage?
No. I'm saying Ben Sirach generally.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so let's
Interesting.
talk about patriarchs and matriarchs now.
It's about time.
So now we're going to add a few words here. So, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, and God of our Avotenu. So now, are we going to translate this as patriarchs, or are we going to translate it as fathers? Sorry, fathers or ancestors. It could be understood either way, right? So, but what you'll see in some Siddurim is perhaps in parentheses afterwards, perhaps not in parentheses, or perhaps not at all, right? You'll see Ve'imotenu, and our mothers, right? So if you're going to put Ve'imotenu in, that means you've got to translate Avotenu as fathers, right? So because if we're going to genderize by putting Imotenu, we've got to treat Avotenu as gendered as well. So that would be fathers and mothers, or you could just leave it as Avotenu and translate it as ancestors if you're interested in being egalitarian, right? So, and then God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, that's the traditional language. And you'll see different variations of this in different liberal Siddurim. What we find in the conservative movement Siddurim, and if you'd like to see this, you can look on the B page of the Amidah. So after listing the three patriarchs, we now list the matriarchs. Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, right? We follow the exact same format. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, God of Sarah, God of Rebecca, God of Rachel, and God of Leah, right? Notice they put Rachel before Leah.
Yeah, I
which is
just
kind
was
of
going to say
interesting.
that.
Leah was the older one. She married Jacob first, but Rachel was the more beloved wife of Jacob. And that favoritism seems to have found its way into our Siddur as well.
Who made that decision?
The rabbis,
Right?
Which rabbis?
any
Whoever
rabbi.
decided to
Cynthia's gonna go after
edit
her.
this Siddur in this way. Now, the shul I grew up in Seattle, started adding the matriarchs before the Siddur was published. And so there were lots of practices that were taking place in different synagogues before any Siddurim started to introduce matriarchs. And so before it's been published, as you would imagine, there's a lot more variety in what was going on. So the shul I grew up in still uses the version that it used then, which is Elohei Avraham v'Sarah, Elohei Yitzchak v'Rivka, Elohei Yaakov Rachel v'Leah. Right? So God of Abraham and Sarah, God of Isaac and Rebekah, God of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. Kind of putting them all in the same generations. I think the new Machzor switches Rachel and Leah around. So you get Leah and then Rachel. Mike, what does Mishkan Tefillah have?
The current Mishkan has the same wording here, but the previous Siddur, the gray gates of prayer, had Rachel and Leah switched.
Had it switched around. Okay. So, anybody want to make an argument for one version versus another version?
The one I'm used to,
One you're used
Rachel
to.
Leah.
All right, that's probably the strongest argument there is.
Wait, what was your argument? What was that?
She's used to it.
Oh,
Right.
yeah. I think it should go by age.
By age? Yeah, are you an oldest?
No,
Oh, okay. All right.
but I'm the only girl.
Okay.
First wife,
Rabbi, when they started the conservative and the reform start using this kind of version of the
Well, let's see. So the Slim Shalom, this is 2002. I think the Shabbat version was maybe 98. That would have been the first conservative Siddur that included the matriarchs.
so probably in the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm not sure when the first Reform Siddur did. Probably a few years before the first conservative Siddur. We would guess.
So I have an argument.
I do have a
I have
preference.
an argument, which is that I do not like adding
Max, you are breaking up a lot.
Yeah. Say that
Because
again,
I
Max.
think that it is actually more egalitarian to put everyone.
All right, Max, you broke
All right,
up.
my internet's bad.
Didn't hear.
What's wrong?
Sorry, Max.
I think it is more egalitarian to put everyone under ancestors than to put the fathers and then the mothers. Hey.
How
Okay,
about just
so
alphabetical order,
there you
regardless
go.
of gender?
alphabetical by third letter of last name.
There you go. You're good at that, Rabbi. Yeah.
And good luck in changing it.
Yeah. So, all right, so I think, Max, if I heard you correctly, you want to get rid of Imotenu and just keep it as Avotenu, right? And understand it to be
And
inclusive.
later in the Musaf, there are references to Avotenu that people who say Imotenu in Avot don't change.
Yeah, so Sim Shalom
And
that we use at Sinai does not include V'imotenu and translates it as ancestors. I believe the new Lev Shalem does include Imotenu
In brackets.
in brackets. So there's different versions out there. And the problem is that if you're going to start to introduce Imotenu, as you said, you're going to have to do it everywhere in the Siddur. I mean,
Right.
I guess you don't have to, but if you want, if consistency is something that you care about, you would have to.
Right.
you'd
And
have to
then
do
it's
that,
a
right?
matter of
unless, by the way, there is a reason in one place to do it and not a reason in another place to do it, right? And I'll just point out a consideration. We've just seen the text in the Talmud, which is identifying the origin of the Amidah as being based on biblical passage describing Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob doing things. So perhaps the invoking of the patriarchs at the beginning of the Amidah is actually connected to the same teaching that appears in the Talmud, about the origins of what the Amidah is from. And that might be an argument, not necessarily, I would say not an egalitarian argument, but an argument to not add the mothers at this particular place, because it's kind of ignoring what the rabbinic tradition is on the origin of the Amidah in the first place. By adding the Imahot, we perhaps take away from that drash in the interests of egalitarianism. Someone else would say, you know what, we've had 3,000 years of ignoring women's voices, and so it shouldn't surprise us that the rabbis weren't concerned with what the matriarchs spiritual experiences were, and so we're going to add them. We're going to add them here, so that people can make that argument as well. I've seen some cases, and one of the, I think we see this in one of the Masorti Siddurim in Israel, where they don't add the Imahot here, but instead add a piyut, right? A composition, a modern composition, a contemporary composition, talking about the merit of the matriarchs, and insert it into the prayer as an additional thing, not trying to create, let's say, a parallel form as, you know, to what appears for the men. So to leave that part of the prayer intact and to add an additional element in this prayer that perhaps may be more authentic or something. So,
Well, the other way you can see it is, I mean, I can still see that the prayer at the 3 times of the day were instituted by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but I can also see it encompassing their households, and therefore, in the very beginning, also done by their wives. So, I mean, you can interpret it that way too, but I do not like using the word imotenu because it goes against Hebrew grammar, because you don't need the word. You wouldn't normally say imotenu. You would just say avotenu, and then the male and the female are included in the plural.
maybe, but if unless you want to specifically call attention
Yeah.
to women,
Yeah.
in which case, by adding imotenu, you are calling attention to it, right? You're saying, you know what, we have let's say spiritual heroes that are female as well, and just because previous generations didn't acknowledge them in our regular prayers doesn't mean that we can't do that also.
But you don't need to add the word imotenu in, but you can still then include their names, and then that calls out to them too.
You could, I could see arguments on both sides.
And by naming the women, then you've automatically defined avotenu as ancestors and not
Right.
just fathers.
If you're consciously thinking about it.
If I'm saying their names, then I'm consciously thinking about it.
But that's what our Siddur has. It says Avoteno.
Yes, it does not, and does not put imotenu in. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Now let's look at the bottom part here. Magen Avraham, right? So we had Magen Avraham, shield of Abraham. We saw that in Ben Sirach. So where does it come from? Genesis 15:1. Achar devarim ha'ele hayad devar Adonai el Avram. Whoops. B'machazeh lemor al tira Avram anochi magen lach scharcha harbe ma'od. Right. So sometime later, the word of the Lord came to Avram. His name hasn't been changed yet. In a vision, God said, "Fear not, Avram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." Right. So just as we saw that there's the version of the Amidah that goes back to the patriarchs, and we see that their legacy invoked in the opening blessing. The final bracha for that opening blessing uses that language explicitly. Magen Abraham, shield of Abraham, and it's using biblical language in order to do so. Right? Just as God was a shield to Abraham, God be a shield to us as well. All right. Now, what about? Okay, now if we're going to include matriarchs, we need something parallel to Abraham. So, Sarah it is. Okay. Now, our Siddur has poked, right? So you can see the word poked is added. Melech ozer ufoked umoshia umagen. The poked is not part of the traditional version. And then after Magen Avraham, we add ufoked Sarah. So poked means to. It doesn't exactly mean to remember. Something
Recognize.
like to take note of. To take note of someone, to make a list and include someone in a list, maybe.
Also, it's to meet, I guess.
Oh, you can meet somebody, yeah. But all right, so where does it come from? And maybe this is familiar to us. Varonai pakad et Sarah kasher amar vayas Adonai l'Sarah kasher diber. This was also last week's Torah portion. We read this as the Torah portion for the first day of Rosh Hashanah, right? The Lord pakad et Sarah took note of Sarah as he had promised, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. By doing what? She got pregnant and then had Isaac. Right? So now we've got a biblical verse that is talking about God doing something on behalf of Sarah. So that can be if we want to create something that is the equal of Magen Avraham, this is a good option. Poked Sarah, right?
Yeah. I
God
think
is Magen Avraham and Poked Sarah. God remembers Sarah. So just as God remembered Sarah, so too God should remember us. Take note of us.
I like the fact that they added a different line for Sarah, because they could have just said shield of Abraham and Sarah, just to throw her in, but this is more thought out.
Yeah, so they could say Magen Avraham v'Sarah, perhaps. Shlomo, when you hear the word poked, what do you think?
It comes to my mind visit.
A what?
Visit.
Visit? Okay. What about not like a mefaked?
Yes, it's from the same root.
Yeah. So I was told, I don't know if this is true, that some Israelis find this a strange word to use despite its biblical origins, because mefaked is a drill sergeant. And so mefaked is like somebody who orders you around, right? Right. And so it might not have the best connotations in modern Hebrew to some Israeli, to some Israelis.
Yeah,
But it's got a good.
It sounds like God ordered Sarah.
God ordered Sarah, right? That's what. Now the pshat of the text doesn't mean that, right? It means to take note of Sarah and to enable. Like, so it's a blessing, really. But in modern Hebrew, it may have a different connotation. Mike, what does Mishkan Tefillah have?
It uses a different word, Ezrat.
Ezrat Sarah. Okay, and so that is what the shul that I grew up in. That's what it uses. Ezrat Sarah. Ezrat Sarah means the help of Sarah, the helper of Sarah.
What's the biblical origin of that?
I don't think there is one. I'm not sure where it comes from.
The footnote in Mishkan points to this same verse, but I don't know how and they point out Poked, but I don't know how they get Ezrat from there.
The interesting thing is, with the connotation of ordered, it almost makes it sound like then Sarah is obligated, and that kind of helps the egalitarian cause.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that. I mean,
Well, I know, because it's modern. I know.
Yeah.
I like Ezrat better because they're both active verb. God gives you a shield, and God takes care of you, and God bless you, instead of that you just got noticed. They're both, one's passive and one's, I can't think of the word for it, active. So it's active by providing a shield, and it would be active to help.
Yeah.
In the Exodus story, what word is used when God remembers Israel?
In which part?
I will take that as far as rot being a better word. But if one has the biblical origin, one does not.
Max, there's something wrong with your connection, unfortunately.
Are there any other active verbs that are used in biblical references to Sarah with God?
I don't know. I'd have to go and look closely. I mean, Sarah laughs. So that's something that God does to say. I'm not sure. I mean, if you're going to look for a verb, this is probably the best one in the Torah, which is why they chose it. And it also, it's Magen Ufoked. It sounds kind of have a similar sound to them, perhaps. Okay, that's actually, so this is a good place for us to stop. Next week we'll continue with the next bracha, which is Gvurot, which means mighty acts, and I'll just, as a foreshadowing it, one of the mighty acts that we insert into that blessing for this time of year is that God causes the rain, the wind to blow and the rain to fall. So we've
Good timing.
Yeah.
thank God for our recent rainfall, and I think we've got some more rain coming at the end of the week.
Yep.
It fell for about 2 minutes.
But yeah, well, it created some puddles.
Rabbi, at the beginning, it's a ומביא גואל לבני בניהם למען שמו באהבה. We didn't discuss what is the Goel. For me, it's always bothered me. What is the Goel? Is it the Mashiach?
Oh yeah, I think so.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is so Shlomo's referring to where it says Umevi Goel livnei b'neihem. God brings a Goel. A Goel means redeemer. Livnei b'neihem, to the children of their children. L'ma'an shemo b'yava, for the sake of his name in love.
Because Goel is not a biblical term. We don't see Mashiach in the 5 books. That's kind of
no. It's a later biblical term, but it's a core belief of the rabbis,
right?
Without a doubt. Let's kind of go back here. We have in Ben Sirach, Hodu leGoel Yisrael. So God, in this case, God is the redeemer of Israel. But in the bracha here, we want God to bring a Goel for us, someone to redeem us. So this is a messianic reference, and there are other messianic references explicitly in the Amidah. So that shouldn't surprise us.
One other thing in the Reform Prayer Book, I have a copy of the 1975 Siddur, and it has a half dozen different services.
Okay.
They all use the traditional wording, and they've been very creative in their translations. The English includes the matriarchs, includes the prophets, but the Hebrew is still just Avot.
Okay, yeah. So adding what you wanted to say in the translation, but leaving the original,
Yes.
as it is. Yeah, that's one of the approaches. Yeah, but none of them change the Hebrew to something egalitarian.
No, I haven't looked at it very closely, but
I wouldn't expect it to in the 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
When the rabbis quote Ben Sira in the Talmud, are they quoting it as a authoritative text, or are they quoting it as something they're dismissing?
Yeah, I think they quote it as authoritative. And Ben Sirach is wisdom literature. Like it has a lot in common with Proverbs and and other books that are in the Bible.